Good morning and welcome to Rising. I'm Niall Stanage and we have a great show for you today. We do have a slightly different show than normal because our friend Amber Duke, who's normally my co-host on a Friday, is ill. Nothing serious, she'll be back soon. But at the last moment, I'm glad to be joined by the Hill's Washington correspondent, Drew Petrimo. Good to have you here.
Great to be here in a new studio.
Exactly.
I love the digs you guys have in here.
Exactly. It's all gone luxury and Rising these days.
We've talked a lot on other shows, but so it'll be good to re-engage this conversation in a little bit longer form, and excited to be here.
For sure. Looking forward to it. So, coming up on Rising, Navy Admiral Frank Bradley is contradicting the Washington Post reporting on the first alleged drug boat strikes in the Caribbean. He says that Secretary Pete Hegseth never gave a, quote, kill everybody order.
Plus, actress Halle had some harsh words for Governor Gavin Newsom, saying that he should not be our next president.
And Britain's Prince Harry appeared on Stephen Colbert's show, where he took a surprising swipe at President Trump. But first, federal agents arrested a suspect Thursday in connection to the January the 6th pipe bomb case. The man taken into custody is 30-year-old Brian Cole from Virginia.
He's accused of planting 2 pipe bombs outside the DNC and RNC headquarters on the eve of the Capitol riots. Here's FBI Director Kash Patel on the arrest.
I'm proud to stand here before you and say, we solved it. He will have his day in court. The American public and the world will learn even more information through the legal process, as we have committed under this Attorney General. We are the most transparent law enforcement operation in U.S. history, but we are also going to make sure accountability is delivered to its fullest extent. And that happens in the courts of law with our U.S. attorneys and our prosecutors.
And now here is more from Attorney General Pam Bondi.
Today's arrest happened because the Trump administration has made this case a priority. The total lack of movement on this case in our nation's capital undermined the public trust of our enforcement agencies. This cold case languished for 4 years until Director Patel and Deputy Director Bongino came to the FBI.
Now, Cole was charged on counts of transporting an explosive device in interstate commerce, as well as attempted malicious destruction by means of explosive materials. Footage captured by security cameras shows the path of the suspected bomber on the night in question, but his identity was concealed by wearing a hoodie and a face mask, and law enforcement struggled for years to come up with any suspects. Investigators say they used Brian Cole's cell phone data to track his location when the bombs were placed and compared it with the security footage. They also say his credit card records show him purchasing items consistent with the components used to manufacture the bombs.
It's not clear yet if officials have determined the suspect's motive or if there was any connection between the bomb planting and the events at the Capitol the following day. The case has become a hotbed for conspiracy theories, with people suggesting the suspect didn't act alone, this is before this man was arrested, or that the FBI ignored evidence that would have led to an earlier arrest. Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massie joined in on the conversation, writing on X, 3 things I'll never believe about the January the 6th pipe bomb story. 1, the bomber was a lone wolf. 2, the FBI was this incompetent for 4 years on a case this consequential. 3, the perpetrators were pro-Trump. Meanwhile, Young Turks founder Cenk Uygur says they've arrested the January the 6th pipe bomber. His name is Brian Cole, but we don't know his motive or politics yet. If he's on the left, Trump team will blame everyone on the left, will want to do crackdowns and will call for extreme punishment. If he's on the right, he might pardon him. First of all, I always get that Young Turks guy's name wrong, so I apologise in advance. Is it Cenk or Cenk? Cenk, okay. Cenk. Well, in any event, obviously a big story here. There were a lot of conspiracy theories around this for a long time. Yeah. In the end, it seems to have been basically very good, if belated, police work, I think, going through all these records. It doesn't seem to have been a new tip of any description, just going through previous information about what the component parts were for those pipe bombs and who might have bought them, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we don't know what we don't know, what was going on inside that investigation, but the fact that it took so long and then they kind of used regular police work to figure it out will, I think, just add fuel to the fire of conspiracy theories that burn. I mean, just a few weeks ago, I think it was The Blaze, which is kind of a right-wing publication, was kind of pinning this on a Capitol police officer based on the way they walked and the suspect walked, which apparently now doesn't appear to be the case at all. No word yet on if there's going to be a retraction on that, because it's a pretty serious accusation that was leveled that turns out to look at least not to be true. But you have, like Congressman Massie there, kind of adding fuel to the fire still by saying that one of the things we don't know the motives of this person at all, but he's saying he's already not going to believe that he is, a supporter of President Trump. We don't know that right now, so I don't know that he does either.
Right, and I think one of the dangers with this case, or with any case in such a politically polarized environment, is that people just attach theories that are purely, that they're pulling out of thin air, essentially, or pulling out of their own political beliefs, rather than based on the evidence. I think that The Blaze has finally retracted that story, which I think is important, because that was a very, to my mind, thinly based story based on so-called gait analysis, as you suggested, right. The suggestion that this person was walking in a way similar to the suspect. So, that was a kind of journalistic disaster there. It's obviously worth mentioning that the person who they have arrested will have his day in court, will have the capacity to try to rebut those charges, is entitled to the presumption of innocence, but obviously an apparently major breakthrough in the case.
Also an interesting question here as to whether or not the blanket pardon that President Trump issued for people that participated in what happened at the Capitol would actually possibly apply to him. People have criticized it for being overly broad. I think it could possibly be unintended consequences if that actually ends up being used by this suspect's lawyers in the future to say he can't be held accountable. Yeah,
there are a lot of interesting issues to this, one of which is that some of the conspiracies on the right were about the idea that the pipe bombs were in some sense an inside job, and I think the conspiracy theory was they were intended to draw Capitol Police and other attention away from the Capitol to, make it easier to breach or something. That, from what we're reading, doesn't seem to be the case at all. The only belief that I have seen ascribed to this guy who has been arrested was some reporting that he had expressed anarchist beliefs of some kind. That doesn't seem at all, what would be the word, consistent with the idea that it's some sort of inside job intended to do something about the Capitol riot.
Yeah, I heard the word extremist, thrown around somewhere regarding to this person, but we'll have to wait and see. I think there's a danger sometimes in trying to read too much into the beliefs of somebody who's acting in an extreme measure. I don't think they're often consistent. There's often mental illness, so I think we should all be careful. I know there's frequently this rush in the political sphere to assign blame. People want to hope it's not their side and want it to be the other side, and then as soon as it is, they use that as a cudgel to beat down the other side politically. So I think we should probably be some resistance to that, but just the fact that it took this long and then ended up being regular old police work. Listen to some of what the law enforcement officials in the Trump administration said. There was a lot of kind of chest beating over their ability to do this investigation and the lack thereof of the Biden administration. But it would be interesting to see what comes out of this the case, and when you start to see discovery and stuff like that, how they actually track this down, because it's, quite frankly, some interesting police work that went into it. Apparently it was kind of a re-examination of pre-existing, that just leads to all kind of questions, because it's such a high-profile case. Right. To think that they would just kind of open it up and, hey, what about that again? Maybe we've run that down. So,
yeah.
I don't know.
5 years, a long time as well.
Yeah.
Up next, Navy Admiral Frank Bradley denies that Pete Hegseth gave an order to kill everybody in the U.S. military strike on an alleged drug boat. Stay with us. We'll be right back with that. New details are emerging about that first alleged drug boat strike that the U.S. conducted in the Caribbean in September.
Navy Admiral Frank Bradley is denying that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave orders to kill all the passengers on board that day. This is in reference to a November Washington Post article which had reported, quote, as two men clung to a stricken burning ship targeted by SEAL Team 6, the Joint Special Operations Commander followed the Defense Secretary's order to leave no survivors, end quote. On Thursday, the Senate Committee on Intelligence held a classified briefing with both Bradley and the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair General Dan Kane. Both GOP Senator Tom Cotton and the chair of that committee, and Democratic Congressman Jim Hines affirmed that Bradley's testimony said Hegseth gave no such order. Here's more of what Cotton had to say about the strikes.
The second strike and the third and the fourth strike on September 2nd were entirely lawful and needful, and they were exactly what we'd expect our military commanders to do.
What exactly did you see in terms of the video of the second strike? Were there survivors?
I saw two survivors trying to flip a boat loaded with drugs down for the United States, back over, so they could stay in the fight.
Democratic Senator Chris Coons, however, had a much different perspective. Let's take a look.
But I have more policy questions than ever about the framing of the mission, the rules of engagement. I'm not going to get into the details, but there were some things that I was briefed on that are reassuring about process, about intelligence, about the role of the JAGs. But more broadly, what we are asking the men and women of our armed forces, and in particular special forces, to do, I think still lacks clear justification.
Meanwhile, a recent Inspector General report surrounding Signalgate was highly critical of Hegseth. The report found that the Defense Secretary violated department policy by using the Signal app on his own phone to discuss upcoming Houthi strikes, and that he jeopardized troop safety. In a statement, the Defense Department responded, quote, "The Inspector General review is a total exoneration of Secretary Hegseth and provides what we knew all along. No classified information was shared. This matter is resolved and the case is closed," end quote. Let's take the first story first, shall we? I want to talk about this Washington Post report, because obviously when this all came out, this quote that they had attributed to Secretary Hegseth, to kill them all, leave no quarter, at least what we're hearing, the reports out of the meeting, and it is from both Democrats and Republicans, that was not the instruction that was given. It would be interesting to see what the Washington Post says after that, but if that wasn't true, it's a pretty big mishap by the Post.
Yeah, I mean, I would not like to be the Post reporter or reporters responsible for that story and hear reports, as you say, from Democrats as well as Republicans, that the admiral said that order was not given. And it seems pretty clear. Jim Himes, who we quoted in a different way there about the Democrat, he's the Democrat from Connecticut. He was talking about the fact that there was neither a kill everybody order given, apparently, nor one to give no quarter, which is military parlance amounting to the same thing. There is obviously, and we can get into this in a second, there's a whole big controversy about these strikes overall, the legal justifications for them, whether they could potentially amount to illegal operations writ large. But you're right to point out that the thing that ignited the current controversy was that Post story saying that Hegseth had given an order to kill everybody, and then there was this strike, there were two survivors clinging to wreckage, and a second strike came to kill them. A second strike did come to kill them, it's just that we're not sure what order preceded that, if any, specifically from Hegseth.
Let's talk about the overarching policy. I'll make the argument that I think the Trump administration and many Republicans probably would. These transnational drug organizations smuggle drugs and people into the U.S. and wreak havoc in Mexico and here in the U.S. as well. The drugs that they sell provide funding that allows them to continue with these operations. Maybe some of the drugs that they're transporting on particular missions aren't necessarily destined for the U.S., but the money that they are able to make off of that drug trade fuels their enterprise, which in turn has this big impact on the U.S., and that is why they're being targeted.
Yeah, look, I know that is the argument on the right. I would push back on most elements of that argument that the administration is making. For a start, the administration very much foregrounds fentanyl in all of this. Now, the vast bulk of fentanyl that comes into the United States is manufactured in Mexico from ingredients, for want of a better term, imported from China. It doesn't come from Venezuela. There's some suggestion that cocaine originating in Colombia sometimes goes through Venezuela, but typically then goes up through the Pacific. The broader issue, Drew, I think, is this idea that the Trump administration is propagating, that the trafficking of drugs amounts to a declaration of war or an attack on the United States. It doesn't seem to me that that is really a sustainable argument. I mean, the actual act of making war, a military, or a terrorist group bombing the United States, yes, those are clearly acts of war. Of course, I'm not saying importing drugs is a great thing or we should let it happen, but there are very well established drug interdiction policies for that are not just about blowing people out of the water in international seas.
What about the notion, though, that the same cartels that are shipping these drugs around and that we're blowing up are also involved in other nefarious activities that more directly impact the U.S. and that is the connection that's being made, even though, like what you said about fentanyl, which is the biggest problem, precursors from China, manufactured in Mexico. I'm not an expert in cartels, but I don't know if the same cartels that are doing that in Mexico are also involved in Venezuela and Colombia, cocaine and marijuana trade. But if there are connections there to be made, disrupting those networks could be a goal of American military.
I think the disruption of those networks is perfectly valid, but that military strikes aren't the way to do that. And I think this actually goes to, you mentioned about, Venezuela versus other cartels. There is, perhaps we don't have time to go fully into this, but there is a whole other element of this, which is the administration's at least openness to some even more direct form of military action in Venezuela itself, and the desire to depose Nicolas Maduro. All of that is sort of wrapped up in this question of the drug strikes, because of course President Trump only just pardoned a former president of Honduras who had in fact been convicted of drug trafficking related offences. So you put the pardon on one hand and the military strikes on the other, and it's hard, I think, to see that to create a plausible case for the administration.
I want to talk about Signalgate really quick. Senator Cotton made this point when he was talking yesterday. He said we're making a mountain out of a molehill, and that the idea that these communications could have gotten to the hands of somebody that could have acted on them and they could take action against military forces is far-fetched. We're making a big deal out of nothing.
Yeah, I mean, that element of it, I'm not going to pretend to have some great expertise in. I do think the use of these chats and of course their initial exposure by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic was embarrassing. The granularity of it, I'm just not so expert in.
All right. Well, next on Rising, Trump has replaced the architect leading his $300 million White House Ballroom project. Don't go anywhere.
President Donald Trump has replaced the architect he hand-selected to design his White House Ballroom. The Washington Post reported that James McCreary II, who for 3 months led Trump's effort to design the $300 million building, has a boutique architecture firm whose selection raised questions about whether it had the ability to complete such a large, high-profile project. One source told the outlet that Trump and McCreary reportedly butted heads over the president's desire to keep increasing the size of the ballroom. The deciding factor, however, was reportedly McCreary's firm's small staff and, quote, inability to hit deadlines, unquote. That is what supposedly led to his departure.
Trump has chosen architect Shalom Baranis, who has been designing and renovating government buildings for decades after the 9/11 terror attacks. Baranis led a $1 billion renovation of the Pentagon. He has handled projects involving the main Treasury building near the White House, the Federal Reserve, and the headquarters of the General Services Administration. White House spokesperson Davis Engel said in a statement, Shalom is an accomplished architect whose work has shaped the architectural identity of our nation's capital for decades, and his experience will be a great asset to the completion of this project.
The White House and McCreary's representative have both said that McCreary remains involved in the project in a consulting role. It's unclear whether McCreary stepped back from the ballroom voluntarily, according to the Washington Post. So the saga of the ballroom continues, Drew. I am not enough of an expert in architecture to know the conflicting or contrasting styles of these two guys, but it seems like, I mean, obviously this is a signature Trump project in all possible ways, and he seems dissatisfied, apparently, that the first guy, there was some question about whether that firm could hit the deadlines or not.
My favorite quote from this story and this whole fiasco is that the White House said that with the previous architect that they had been having a constructive dialogue. I don't know if that's supposed to be taken literally or figuratively, but apparently they're not.
Yeah.
Apparently they're not. Do people really care? Is this really important to the American people? We like talking about it because we're right down the street from it. I don't know if in Main Street anybody gives a hoot what President Trump does at the White House. He's certainly breaking rules, and he's certainly doing it in his own way. Like, stop me if you want to, if you dare try. But what is your take on? Is this really an important issue considering everything else that's going on?
So I personally basically agree with you, right? I, on this show, have numerous times been critical of Trump for various other things that I consider more important. What I'm struck by, though, and I don't know what it's like in your social circle, but I've been surprised at the number of friends who have raised it unprompted with me. And it's not that they're necessarily, I mean, these are people typically critical of Trump generally, but like they raise that issue more than some of the other things, whether it's to do with ICE or migration or rule of law that I might think are more important. It does seem to have some emblematic importance to some people, I think.
I think you might have classier friends than me that are actually stand up
possibly
being invited to it. No, I haven't heard a lot of people that have a problem with it that aren't already upset at the president and think that everything he does is terrible. There's also this notion of, they've had these events where they have big dinners and big officials come to D.C. and they have to be out in a tent and it's uncomfortable. So I wonder, there could be some point to that there. I just wonder what this is going to look like at the point where it's going to be so big that it's going to dwarf the main part of the White House and it's going to be a huge construction site for time to come. But
yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's actually a really interesting point, because Amber and I had discussed this on a previous Friday, and one of our few points of agreement is that we like classical architecture, and we can see some of the buildings, including the Capitol, from our studio here. Apparently, this new architectural firm is less into that classical style and more into modernism and so forth. I assume you just can't do that at the White House because a modernist structure would be so incongruous with the rest of the building. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. Meanwhile, trouble mounting again for Pete Hegseth. Separately from what we're talking about, the New York Times has filed a lawsuit, did so on Thursday, against the Pentagon, attempting to overturn new rules imposed by Mr. Hegseth. We'll talk about that next. Stick around. The New York Times has filed a lawsuit against the Department of Defense over the Pentagon's new restrictions on press access.
The lawsuit was filed in the federal court in Washington, D.C. on Thursday. It named the Defense Department, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and Chief Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell as defendants.
Charles Statlander, spokesman for the Times, said, quote, "The policy is an attempt to exert control over reporting the government dislikes."
Pentagon Press Secretary Kingsley Wilson said the American people don't trust these propagandists because they stopped telling the truth. So we're not going to beg these old gatekeepers to come back, and we're not rebuilding a broken model just to appease them.
Adam Schiff reacted, writing on X, Pete Hegseth removed respected journalists from the Pentagon because he feared their willingness to publish the truth. Then he brought in only some of the nation's most seasoned sycophants to take their place. While several news outlets like Associated Press, Washington Post and CNN were denied access to the Pentagon as they refused to accept the new restrictions, Matt Gaetz, the former congressman, was spotted at Wilson's briefing on Tuesday.
Former Congressman Matt Gaetz lashed out at CNN anchor Aaron Burnett for apparently questioning his journalistic credentials. Gaetz wrote on X in parts, "Oh, hey, CNN, thanks for covering my participation in today's Pentagon press briefing for One America News Network. you seemed interested in my qualifications. I served 8 years on the House Armed Services Committee and often asked the most penetrating questions of Democrats and Republicans who appeared before me. I can also confidently report that CNN is still not allowed in the building.
A bit of spice there from Matt Gaetz, as we might expect. It's always good. So, look, I mean, I think my views on this are probably somewhat predictable. I'm glad that the New York Times is suing. I think that it is important that journalistic outlets stand up for the freedom of the press. And it is, I think, notable that the new restrictions caused a walkout not only from the New York Times and the Associated Press and The Hill, for that matter, but also from outlets that are fairly explicitly right-leaning, the Daily Caller, Fox News, and so on and so forth. So I'm glad that the Times is suing. Do you want to make a case for the defense or not? I don't know.
Washington leaks like a sieve, and the Pentagon is one of those actors in that enterprise that where stuff comes out that's not supposed to come out. And at times, there can be an argument made that has put people in danger. Information has not just come out through the regular press, but through hacks and released information. And I could see a member of the Trump administration arguing that we have to stop that. And it's, frankly, it's not just been the Trump administration. There was a crackdown during the Obama administration on leaks. And, I think the Trump administration would argue that we're actually trying to do something about this now instead of just talking about the problem.
Yeah, that is certainly part of their argument. And in this new policy, one of the most contentious elements in it is a ban or a bar on members of the press, quote, soliciting information from people. But then one of the questions there is how do you define soliciting? I mean, in the nature of reporting, one is soliciting information all the time. And it is obviously a valid line of inquiry for Pentagon reporters to seek kind of insight into what's going on behind the scenes. And there appears to be an attempt to curb that quite narrowly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is another question of whether or not this actually matters or not. Are we making a big deal about something that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter? If you just look at what happened with these boat strikes, the Washington Post, New York Times, still very well-sourced inside the Pentagon and able to get their hands on information related to these stories that probably the Pentagon didn't want to come out.
Yeah, I think that is a valid point, and it is certainly the case that, to their credit, none of those organizations have sort of folded their tents and said, we're not going to cover the Pentagon. The question is, or the issue is, we're not covering the Pentagon from inside the building because we are not willing to submit to these requirements. On a lighter note, to a degree, are you amused by the Matt Gaetz thing and the various other elements where there's now this media war between all the people who walked out, which, as I say, encompasses a fairly broad spectrum, and, well, very Trump-friendly outlets?
I think Matt Gaetz does make a valid point that he asks tough questions about the foreign policy apparatus, no matter of Republicans and Democrats. He's been highly critical of American foreign policy. I don't know that it's a flex to say that you signed a paper and agreed to limit your reporting abilities, and that's why you get to go and CNN doesn't. I think the harder thing to do is to not sign it and report from the outside. I imagine, though, that some of the most sensitive conversations and the way that these stories are reported don't always happen inside the Pentagon building.
Yeah.
They probably meet over, signal, frankly, and in places that aren't so public. So I don't know how big of an impact it has on the ability of people that report on the Pentagon to get that information out. I'll be interested to see what happens with this lawsuit. I think, it's another interesting thing to me is that there were other organizations apparently that wanted to join in with the New York Times, but the New York Times kind of wanted to go it alone. I don't know if that's like a flex on the New York Times as part of that, saying that, look, we want to fight this on our own. We kind of, I think in their eyes, think they stand above the rest when it comes to the depth and of their sources, at least.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because there is a whole question in the media at the moment as to which organizations are more inclined to, I would say, submit to Trump demands. Obviously, without getting into the whole CBS controversy, there's a massive issue because of the fact that they settled that case that Trump brought on, I would say, extremely spurious grounds about the 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris and all of that. And there have been various organizations that have been criticized for cozying up to the Trump administration by doing its bidding or by accommodating it in some way. Just briefly to circle back to the Pentagon stuff, I think that one of the main difficulties really right now is the people who did agree to go into the Pentagon. If Matt Gaetz wishes to argue that he's going in there and he's going to ask tough questions, that's okay. But there have been a number of people from other outlets in there sort of glorying in the way that they are there basically to support the administration, to cheerlead for the administration. And I think that's a very different thing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is kind of a new brand of journalism that has sparked up really on the right and the left, where you have people that are more advocates than journalists, the rise of kind of the substackification of journalists, where I think people see they could advance their careers more by having like a hard right or a hard left opinion. So I think, I think those people are probably more likely to sign something that says that they'll toe the line of a Republican, and then, you know, I'd be interested to see what happens if there's ever a Democratic. Hard for me to see really anybody other than the Trump administration taking steps like this, because just the way that they perceive the media as being so against them and they're constantly at war. But, you know, I remember during the Obama administration, there were some leak investigations that many people in the press thought crossed the line. So it's not new for an administration to be at loggerheads with members of the media. But as all things Trump, he usually, you know, takes it just probably a little bit further than past administrations have.
For sure, and I actually think that phrase that you mentioned, the substackification of journalism, that could be a whole conversation in itself, because those people break away from mainstream outlets, you know, to go independent, but often the economics of the Substack thing mean, in fact, you're catering to what a specific audience wants to hear all the time. So there are drawbacks to either model, I think.
Oh, yeah, no, of course.
Meanwhile, Gavin Newsom, the California governor, says he's considering a run for president in 2028, but Oscar-winning actress Halle Berry says she has no interest in supporting him. More on that next. Actress Halle Berry took a shot at California Governor Gavin Newsom earlier this week, saying he should not be the next president. Berry was speaking at the New York Times annual DealBook Summit and came around to the topic of California's Menopause Care Equity Act.
The legislation, which would have increased health care coverage for women going through menopause, had bipartisan support in the state's legislature, but Newsom vetoed the bill last year and then vetoed it again in October of this year, citing cost and implementation concerns. And the Oscar-winning actress is still upset about it. Take a look.
Back in my great state of California, my very own governor, Gavin Newsom, has vetoed our menopause bill, not 1 but 2 years in a row. But that's okay, because he's not going to be governor forever. And with the way he's overlooked women, half the population, by devaluing us in midlife, he probably should not be our next president either. Just saying.
Just saying, indeed. Newsom did respond to Berry's comments, saying that he will look to include expanded menopause care in next year's state budget. He told TMZ reporters that he has connected with Halle Berry's manager, and he said, quote, "We have the ability to reconcile that, so we're reconciling," end quote. This is an issue that Berry has been vocal about for some time. Last year, she co-founded the company Respin Health, which provides support to women going through menopause.
Berry's comments were picked up by conservatives online, with many praising her for speaking out against the governor. Conservative activist and former ESPN anchor Sage Steele, writing on X, "One of many reasons to vote against Gavin Newsom. Thank you, Halle Berry." And Chad Bianco, a Republican candidate to be California's next governor, said, "This took courage. Hollywood has been propping Gavin up. I love seeing her willing to go against the grain."
Newsom has confirmed he's considering running for president, in 2028, but he says he'll wait until after the midterms to make an official decision. as it stands, he's obviously viewed as one of the favourites to win the Democratic nomination. Pretty interesting one, this, Drew. When I first saw the headlines, I was surprised because Halle Berry is, I would say, obviously a liberal-leaning figure. She has. I actually looked up campaign donations in case I'd got that part wrong, but no, she has donated to a few Democrats, including President Obama when he was an active candidate. And so for her to take a shot at Newsom was interesting, but it is obviously based on pretty substantive grounds, at least, which is, as we said in the introduction, her advocacy for increased care for women experiencing menopause and Newsom's veto of that legislation.
I just want to point out that we are two men here sitting wearing makeup talking about menopause.
Absolutely.
So we'll couch it with that. But
the comments section will have plenty to say about that, I assure you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it appears that Governor Newsom has extended an olive branch and that he's going to work on getting some funding for this legislation. He was worried that if this was the bill was implemented that Halle Berry was promoting, that it would actually lead to increased costs for other people's health care. But I do think there is a conversation to be had here in how much Gavin Newsom will be accepted into the kind of progressive, online, Hollywood aspect of the Democratic Party, because he hasn't always been seen as kind of the heir apparent to that movement. You think more about like AOC, Bernie Sanders, even Mamdani. Gavin Newsom, I think, has some work to do to solidify his standing with the base of the Democratic Party. I think he's probably done a lot of that with his prominence on social media and the way he mocks the Trump administration, but California has obviously had a lot of issues that are going to make him vulnerable in a general election to Republican attacks. And I think there are issues that he's going to face in a Democratic primary, which everybody thinks he's going to hop into at some point, where he's going to have some struggles to convince people on the left that he's really one of them.
Yeah, I think those are great points. To go back to the first one first, the menopause issue, you're absolutely right to say that Newsom isn't saying, oh, I don't care about these menopause health coverage for menopause-related issues. His argument is that the legislation as drawn up was too broad, could have unintended consequences, and he says the same objective can be met in other ways. Now, the Team Halle Berry says that there are other states like Illinois and Michigan and so on that has moved in these kind of areas with good outcomes. But the bigger picture issue, I think, is a really interesting one about Newsom and the progressive side of the Democratic Party. He definitely was not identified with that side. I mean, he's a liberal governor of California, but he's not an AOC Sanders type figure. He did seem to be trying to at least court, if not the harder left, at least people who want a more combative approach from the Democratic Party. Remember, just after the election, he himself had seemed to go the opposite direction briefly on his podcast, and he brought on people like Steve Bannon and the late Charlie Kirk. But recently he has been much more forceful. There have been all the tweets mocking Trump's sort of tweeting style and just generally trying to, metaphorically speaking, punch Trump on the nose more frequently. But is that enough to get progressives on his side? It may not be, and controversies like this do, I think, feed into that conversation.
It'll be fascinating to see the Democratic primary and how this starts to shake up. Obviously, a lot of time between now and the midterms, and you have to think the other Democrats that really want to run for president and see Newsom as a threat, because right now he's kind of the de facto leader in some ways of the Democratic Party because he's so prominent on social media. You wonder if they're going to start trying to chip into that even before they get in the race. Opposition research, through the way they talk about Gavin Newsom. Obviously, he brings with him the California baggage that I think, you think of somebody like Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. She, with her Midwest roots and also her possible aspirations, I think would, I could see an opening for her to attack him as being kind of an out-of-touch coastal elite, as people usually try to paint Democrats from California, New York.
Yeah, and I think that is a danger in Newsom's case. Do you remember, this is going back, of course, several years to the pandemic days, but he got into difficulty during the pandemic because on one hand he was imposing pretty severe restrictions, and then he himself was dining at a very upscale restaurant. Things like that, and just, I think, Newsom's general, demeanor play into that idea of the sort of rich, suntanned Californian with liberal views in a way that, Gretchen Whitmer, who you cited, is very different from that, very much the sort of Midwest, heartland kind of voice. Her star seemed to have fallen a little bit recently. There was that weird meeting with Trump in the Oval Office where she was obscuring her own face with the binders and all of that. But she has a very different political demeanor to someone like Newsom.
She kind of has the opposite problem, right? She might be seen as too close to Trump in the Democratic primary. What do you make of the different areas where we could see people attacking Gavin Newsom? It's not like California is free of problems, homelessness. They've had the housing issue, COVID, the wildfires. I think there's going to be a various issues that Republicans and even Democrats in a Democratic primary could attack him on. Yeah,
I mean, there is definitely baggage relating to California, and he will have to try to find out how he can get around that. Briefly, I mean, the advantage of California, of course, isn't just the size of the state. It does give you a lot of access as a Democratic candidate to a very wealthy donor base, and that can help too.
Yeah, he's pretty nimble too with his the way he can talk about these things. And I think in a time when so much of politics is like how you appear on social media, your ability to communicate extemporaneously, appear on podcasts, he's kind of a creature of this moment, but again, does come with a lot of baggage.
For sure.
Up next on Rising, Prince Harry took a jab at President Trump on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert this week. We'll be right back after this. Prince Harry elicited some boos when he appeared on the Stephen Colbert Show this week, but they didn't appear to be directed at him. The royal took a shot at President Trump during a conversation about Christmas movies. Take a listen.
I genuinely thought this was the audition for the Gingerbread Prince Saves Christmas in Nebraska.
What? No, I mean, that sounds like a fantastic movie, but you're an actual prince. Why would you want to be in one of those movies?
Well, you Americans are obsessed with Christmas movies, and you're clearly obsessed with royalty, so why not?
Hold on. Look, I wouldn't say we're obsessed with royalty.
Really? I heard you elected a king.
No, he's got a point.
While Harry has been in the spotlight for all sorts of issues, from he and his wife leaving the British royal family to their battle with the British government for personal security protection, this is one of the first times that the Duke of Sussex has spoken out on Trump and American politics. I'm caught between the devil and the deep blue sea here, defending the British royal family or President Trump.
Irishman, who's worse?
Exactly. I mean, I'm more opposed in principle to the British royal family, but I have lots of objections to the Trump administration. I kind of even though I have a dislike of royalty overall, I tend to slightly defend Harry and Meghan Markle because I dislike their enemies more than I dislike them, including their enemies within the royal family. Look, he's entitled to do that. It's not a bad line. It was obviously a scripted line for him. Fine, I'm not going to get too outraged one way or another over that.
I think he could probably use some work on his delivery.
His acting abilities,
and
maybe?
I do think it's a bit ironic for any British person to be making fun of our obsession with the royals, especially a member of the royal family. That's why we kicked them out of here.
Indeed. It's also why he gets big money for his Netflix specials and so forth, right? So there's all that too.
The whole thing is ridiculous, you know, and his criticism of the Trump administration probably doesn't have any impact on anybody because I don't think that anybody listens to what he says or thinks about American politics. He's a celebrity. People follow. I think there might be a split in the U.S. similar to there is in the U.K. Like I know there are a lot of people in the U.K. that do think the royal family is important and something to be followed and interesting. And obviously the history of it is grand, but I take the side of that's why we kicked them out.
Yeah, no, we're in agreement on that for sure. You know, look, you can have, as everyone does, different views on individual members of the royal family. The fundamental problem I have with monarchy, Britain or anywhere else, is the idea that by accident of birth, certain people should be placed above other people. I think that's an absurd and kind of dangerous principle, honestly. Now, as far as Harry and Meghan are concerned or whatever, I think it's interesting their attempt to remake themselves as celebrities, as you say, really trying to sort of make use of not only traditional media, but a kind of social media type role that I think was looked down upon a bit when they were more in the royal family by, you know, Buckingham Palace, as you would imagine, has a very rather staid way of going about these things and all of that. And, you know, from what I read, their attempts to remake themselves in the US have had a pretty mixed track record, actually. People have not been quite so enthused about them as they might have hoped.
What would anger me the most if I was British, and of course I am not, was when public funds are used for these grand extravaganzas and to support their lifestyles. And I mean, look, if you want to have this ceremonial title based in the history of the country, that is obviously important, okay, but the notion that public funds should be used to facilitate that seems crazy to me and against my American ideals.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this actually, you know, we've been having a sort of a light-hearted discussion for obvious reasons. It's Harry appearing on Colbert. But there is another strand of this story at the moment which is more serious, which is the former Prince Andrew, who, of course, has a whole Epstein-related controversy around him, having to, well, been essentially evicted from the mansion that he lives in because he has to give up the title, and the royal family is trying to distance itself from him. But that in turn has opened up this whole debate about the amount of money that the royal family gets from the taxpayer and all of that.
Do you think there will come a time in the UK when there's such a public anger over that? I mean, it seems like at some point there would be a point when the Brits would no longer stand for it.
You would think so, but the tradition is so deeply rooted. The one time I saw it really look shaky, actually, this is going back a long time, was after Diana's death, where the royal family was perceived to be very cold and not actually understand the degree. A lot of English people in particular were really distressed about that. It seemed very shaky at that point. However, that does it for us on Rising Live. Thank you for joining us at short notice, Drew. It's been great to be with you. And look out for more exclusive YouTube content coming your way. Be sure to like, share and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere.